Good morning and welcome to an ACT Chess Association stream of their online events, which are currently being held at leadchess.org on various evenings throughout the week, while the ACT is currently in COVID lockdown. Good news on that. Today, 1st of October, some of the restrictions have been lifted in terms of just being able to visit other households, but in a fortnight, assuming everything stays on track, outdoor gatherings of up to, I think, 25 people will be allowed, and then at the end of the month, more people will be allowed to get together outdoors. And I'm kind of thinking that's probably around about the time when street chess might restart once I sort some things out with King O'Malley's. But anyway, my name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, and the game I'm looking at today was played in last night's ACT Online Standard event, played with a time limit of 40 minutes plus 15 seconds per move. And it was the final round of that event. And in the end, Minchin Yang, who is black in this game, won the tournament with 5 out of 6, in part because he won this game, finishing half a point ahead of Lachlan Smart and Tim Pearce. So in this game, he is playing Cam Cunningham, and the game starts off with a Sicilian. Now, Cam plays the Mora Gambit here, so d4 straight away, and after takes c3. And the idea is that you want, if you're white, black to take, and then you develop the knight here. And now there are two conflicting opinions about an opening such as this. At least one Grandmaster I attended a seminar for said that this is one of the few sound gambits. Most gambits these days have been refuted by ruthless computer analysis, but the Mora Gambit is quite sound, at least to the level of equality. Grandmaster Nigel Short, on the other hand, has been known to say, what crime did black commit in the opening that allows white to give up a free pawn? So anyway, c3, and in this case, Minchin declined to take the pawn with g6, and this leads to some interesting thoughts later on in the game about gambiting pawns. So Minchin played g6, and then c takes d4, and in fact white is actually a little bit better now, because white has the 2 pawns in the centre, covering the squares in front of them, and I like this setup of e4 and d4 like this, and this is one of the goals you want to play when you play in the opening. And also, one of the issues about the Sicilian that tends to work in black's favour is you're swapping the c-pawn for the d-pawn in a lot of lines, which means that black will still have 2 pawns in the centre and white only has 1. But in this case, black has actually given white the opportunity to still have 2 pawns in the centre. So without overstating it, at the moment, white has come out of this part of the opening perfectly fine. Black plays the right move, though, d5. You want to fight back in the centre as quickly as you can. Otherwise, white will just build up a crushing position. And there are a couple of responses here. E takes d5. When I analyse, I always like looking at captures as the forcing moves. So E takes d5. You can bring the knight out, and the idea here, of course, is after knight c3, you take that way. And black can develop quite easily and freely, so can white. And white has the isolated d-pawn here on d4, which isn't protected by any other pawns. This is a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes it's good for black because white can't defend it and we pile up on it. But sometimes it's good for white because the open files on either side of the pawn are very useful for attacking. The other line coming back here was to take with the queen straight away, but then you get punted by knight c3, hitting the queen. Queen retreats, knight f3, and white, again, is a little bit better in this position. Still with the isolated pawn, but at least developed a few pieces. So in the end, white went for space, and white played e5, not necessarily a bad move. And after knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4. Okay, and the small threat in this position is something like bishop takes f3. Because if the queen takes f3, then the queen is no longer defending the pawn on d4, and the knight will take it. So the other option is after bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and you get sort of ruined pawn structure on the king side. So this is a little trick that's always worth keeping in mind. But bishop e2 is fine, because now if the bishop takes, the bishop will just take back, and there's no damaged pawn structure, and the d-pawn is nice and happily protected. So black finally puts the bishop on g7, which has been threatening to do for the last 4 moves, and then white puts the question to the bishop. And when I say puts the question, because sometimes players will play without thinking bishop to g4, bishop to g5. But after the pawn moves, then they go into a long think. And the point is, if you're going to put your bishop on a g5 or g4 square, you fully expect it to get kicked at some point. And black took and captured back with the bishop, as listed before. And then black played e6. Now, I don't think black was unhappy about swapping the bishop for the knight, because with the remaining bishop and the pawn set up, black still has it reasonably under control. The pawns on f7, e6, and d5, as I've drawn a green arrow over them, cover a lot of the white squares, while the bishop on g7 is covering the black squares. So that's fine, and I don't think black really has anything to worry about here. There's less chance of white's pieces all picking a square, as in white squares, to attack from, because there's no opposing bishop. White, on the other hand, has the two bishops, but the bishop on c1 is going to be slightly blocked in at this moment by the pawns on e4 and d5. D4 and e5, and I think that's what black might have been thinking as well in this case. So we'll play a few more moves. Knight c3. Now, queen b6 could have been played here. The idea, of course, is to gang up on the d-pawn and to make it difficult for the bishop on c1 to move. In theory, the bishop moves, queen takes, knight e2 like this. Could have been tried. Black instead played knight ge7, bring out another piece and get ready to castle. And I think white suddenly became scared that the knight was going to f5 and play g4, but g4 turns out to be quite a weakening move and doesn't really help white a lot. White should have just castled here. And after knight f5, bishop e3 to block, knight takes here, and pawn takes. Now, this is the other interesting thing that I find, especially with lower rated players, and I'm guilty of it myself. Sometimes you're not that flexible in your thinking. You go, well, I don't want to allow double pawns by letting the knight take the bishop on e3. But the pawn on e3 is defending the pawn on d4, which is a good pawn, which is defending the pawn on e5, which is a great pawn. Okay? So sure, you've got double pawns, but at the same time, you've got a nice strong pawn on e5, and you've got an open f-file for the rook as well. And you combine that with the open c-file for the other rook, and white's actually not doing badly in this position. Certainly a lot better than what happened after g4. But you've got to then give away your preconceived notions of double pawns are bad, right? Some double pawns are bad, not all double pawns are bad. And as you get better at chess, you actually become more flexible in your thinking. So instead, queen b6 now got played here. And we're attacking the b pawn and the d pawn. And white played knight to e2. White could have played bishop e3 and given away the b pawn. And at first you go, well, why would you give away a b pawn? But let me refer to my comments right at the top. White played c3 on move 3. White was happy to give away a pawn on move 3 to get development in the opening, and yet suddenly shies away from giving away the b pawn now. And I find that slightly strange with players, is that if you're willing to gambit the pawn in the opening, you should be flexible enough to be willing to gambit the pawn later. So yeah, bishop e3 was probably the right move in this position, giving up the pawn, which you would plan to give up anyway. So knight went back to e2 to try and hang on to everything. And the best move here now for black was queen b4 check. Because after bishop d2, you've still got the b pawn. And again, white shouldn't be upset about this because this is what white wanted to do all along. Or king f1, and after castle, black is a lot better in this position. White is actually suffering from the fact that they don't want to give away a pawn when they should be giving away a pawn. So rook c8, a sensible move nonetheless. Trying to look at the c2 square. White castled finally, black castled finally. b3, okay, clear intention here is to be able to move the c1 bishop now without worrying about dropping the c2 pawn. But it is a little bit slow. Now, I didn't like rook c7 here, and for reasons. In principle, following it up with rook c8 from the rook f to c8 is the right idea, but black didn't quite follow up in the same way. Could have tried the immediate knight to b4 here, looking at the c2 square, and after a3, knight c2, rook b1, f6. Black is a little bit better in here, and in fact, the best way to describe black's play here is disruptive. They're kind of basically making threats in different parts of the board, which is kind of forcing white to play defensive moves rather than aggressive moves here. The only worry in this position is to make sure you don't get the knight on c2 trapped. So, rook c7 instead. Bishop e3 now, which is probably what white wanted to play all along, but didn't want to drop the b pawn. Now, sensible is rook fc8, but the only thing here is you get a3. And again, this is about flexibility. Black's plan had been to play on c2, either knight b4 followed by rook c2 or something like that. And white has ruled out knight b4. But other things have changed. Black's got doubled rooks on the c file. So knight a4, and we're still looking at c2 as our target here. It's just we're using a different arrangement of pieces. Okay? And even after rook b1 here to protect the pawn, rook c2 can be played, but also bishop f8 is another nice move here. The bishop on g7 is kind of okay, but shifting it across to this diagonal and targeting the a pawn as a weakness is probably an even more sensible idea. You're looking at things like knight to c6 from e7, and if for whatever reason white plays b4 to try and protect it, then the c4 square becomes available for the knight. And this is kind of the principle of conquering squares, which I'm not going into great detail, but essentially black has pieces are really well coordinated for conquering squares down the c file. White, on the other hand, this kind of clump of pieces on e2, e3, and f3 really aren't doing a lot. They're just kind of getting in each other's row. Instead, black played knight b4 straight away. Queen to d2. The other option was just to play rook c1 here. I suspect black would have followed up with bringing the f rook across to the c file to keep fighting for the c file. Because after queen d2, the rook just came to c2 with tempo. And the queen had to go back to d1 anyway, so that was a waste of a move and in fact lost a pawn. Rook takes, knight takes. And white is down a pawn. Sure, they were trying to give one away at the start of the game. It turns out that it gets slightly worse here. Knight to g3. The other rook comes across to c8. Knight c6 was better, though, in this position, because at the moment most of the action's happening on the queen side. So the more pieces that get across there, the better off it is. Rook c8 instead. Queen d2 just gave away the b pawn. Queen b1 is possible, and then knight b4. And white is slightly worse, but not dramatically worse here. After queen takes b3, it's just 2 pawns. And white really hasn't got anything going on the king side for compensation. So even bishop d1, which was played, is just kicking the queen to another square. Bishop g5, trying to attack the knight, but the knight just moves. And at some point, black is just going to start marching the a pawn and the b pawn down the board. This is especially easy to do because, funnily enough, black's pieces are all over on that side of the board. Whatever kingside attack dreams white had really haven't been working. Knight goes back to e2, knight into b4. Let's bring up some more pieces. Bishop f6. Okay, it's a move, I suppose. And after queen d3, it wasn't much of a move. I suspect white had dreams of some sort of, if black is silly enough to capture on f6, I then get here, and then I'm looking at trying to mate on g7. But after rook g8, even this isn't happening. I mean, it's annoying for black to get this position, because basically the play should be on the other side of the board. But even here, black isn't losing. So after queen d3, it was just swaps, and with queens off the board, pretty much it's just now how black wins this game, and this is where I want to concentrate on the end. So black's got this position. The one thing that black is doing, which a lot of people tend to miss early on when they start playing chess, is black is trying to cut out any chances white have of finding some trick or counter-attacking. And with queens off the board, that's a lot easier. And if you have a look at the remaining pieces on the board, and this is really important when you exchange stuff, it's not what comes off the board, but what's left on the board that becomes important. And black's pieces are still much better placed. The rook is still controlling that c-file compared to the rook on f1 doing nothing. The knight on d3 is quite a strong piece, especially compared to, say, the bishop on d1, which isn't doing much. So anyway, white avoids one more exchange by retreating the bishop. h6 will give you a kick. Turns out that, again, maybe not necessary to play that move because the bishop's coming back here anyway. Knight AC1 to offer another set of exchanges. You could also try that with knight b2, bishop b3, knight c3. But knight AC1, and the idea is to offer another set of exchanges. Having said that, bishop takes, knight takes, bishop f3. I mean, might cause some problems, a little bit of problems for black here because the knight is under attack on c1 and probably has to move. And the bishop on g7, which I have been saying is a great piece when it gets to do something, still hasn't yet done something. It really has to come back to f8 and then come out of the game that way. But black's trumps of the two pass pawns still are there on the board. So moving on, knight went to g3 instead to avoid that exchange. Knight went to a2, and then white played f4, which I didn't like. However, it turns out that it gave white some fluky chances later in the game. But the main reason I don't like it is it means that the bishop on f3 and to an extent the knight on bishop on e3 and the knight on g3 are now a bit of a liability. They're not protected by pawns anymore, and pawns love protecting pieces. And so when the rook comes to c3, as it does, that piece is going to be sort of hanging. So knight went back here to open up various squares along the c file. The rook, f5, rook c3 to hit the bishop. Rook f3 is another move I'm not a fan of because essentially the more pieces come off the board, the more likely it is black is going to win. So putting yourself into a pin like this can cause some problems because if the bishop moves, rook takes rook, reduces the amount of pieces white has on the board. Knight went back to c6. This turned out not to be the right move, and it was here where white missed their last chance to make something of the game. F takes g6. Okay, F takes g6. Knight e2 hits the rook, and the point is if the rook goes to a3, knight f4 actually now forks the pawn on g6 and the pawn on e6, and suddenly white is winning back at least one pawn, and it's very hard to hang on to both of them, especially if the e pawn falls. Then the d pawn is a liability as well, and then the pawn on e5 might have a chance of sneaking through. But this idea was white's last idea. Now, even though the game was played at a long time control of 40 minutes plus 15 seconds to move, I'm pretty sure white was in serious time trouble at this point, based on the notion that white is normally in serious time trouble. Cam Cunningham does use his time a lot and gets into positions like this. Instead, he played h4, okay, b5, start march the pawn. White can still try this idea, but it's less effective now simply because that b pawn is closer to queening. Knight e2, rook goes to a3, f takes and f takes. And if we play knight f4 again with the same idea of attacking the two pawns, b4 is strong because it's actually quite hard now for black to stop the pawn from becoming a queen. Instead played knight g3. Time trouble's really kicking in at this point because after b4, bishop takes h6. I'm not sure what the intended follow-up after bishop takes was. But rook takes f3 is even stronger in this position because after bishop takes f3, we just take the bishop and you're a piece up. But I assume that was a time trouble blunder. So that was played by Minchin Yang against Cam Cunningham. Minchin was black. Minchin won the game to help win him the tournament. The main point here, which is of curiosity, is white was willing to give up a pawn in this position, but then wasn't willing to give up a pawn in this position, even though they were probably equivalent type pawn sacrifices. So I find that slightly strange, but at the same time, I've seen that happen a lot with players who will play gambit openings but won't play gambit middle games, if you want to put a label on that. So anyway, thank you for tuning in. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. That was from last night's ACTCA Long Time Control event won by Minchin Yang. We are going to run another event starting next week. It'll be 6 rounds, 40 minutes plus 15-second time limit, 1 round per week. You need to get onto Lichess and join the ACTCA Fast Chess Club. It's only open to players resident in Canberra and surrounding regions, plus people who've had a connection with ACT Chess in the past. It isn't open to people from, let me guess, the Ukraine, India, Poland, Russia, had lots of people applying to join from all those countries at various points. Sadly, as much as we'd love to have you, at the moment it's just for local players. So thanks for tuning in. I do these summaries normally the day after the events are run. So we've got a blitz coming up on Monday, so I'm likely to do a summary on Tuesday. There's also Street Chess on Saturday, so I might cover that as well. But until then, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you later.